Hi, my name is Stefan Kaler, and today we're going to be talking about Jerome Powell and the Federal Reserve's big bet on monetary stimulus and inflation. I'm making this video because I feel like the US mainstream financial news media hasn't done a particularly good job explaining all the nuances behind this bet. I hope you find the video useful and interesting. So, without further ado, let's get started. So, previously we saw around 2% inflation per year, even though we were targeting actually a rate of 3% inflation. The reason why we wanted around 3% inflation is because inflation is generally a signal that the economy is growing. An expanding economy results in upward pressure on prices, resulting in some inflation. But in the past year and a half, we've seen about 5.4% inflation annualized. The most recent reading actually even being higher than that at 6.2%. So people are very concerned right now because we're seeing prices get a little bit out of control, and it reminds them of the 1980s when inflation was just nuts. So the easy culprit for this is the giant increase in money supply that we have seen recently. And the increase in money supply does have something to do with it. The recently printed about 40% increase in the money supply pretty substantially, devaluing the dollar. But the money supply isn't everything that's driving the current situation. It's actually a little bit more complicated than that, and it goes back to the quantity theory of money in economics. So this is the equation. I'm going to walk you through it, so don't worry. Don't get intimidated. Even if you don't have an understanding in economics, you're going to understand this equation and the nuances behind it by the time that we're done with this video. So the first part of the equation is M, or money supply, and that is the number of dollars that are in circulation. The second part of the equation is V, or velocity of money, and that is how frequently the dollars change hands. So how many transactions are being made in the economy. And you can see that that is the first half of this equation. This first half before the equal sign needs to stay in some sort of relative balance. And essentially what this first part of the equation is saying is that if money isn't changing hands very frequently in the economy, then prices don't have as many opportunities to appreciate. So this velocity of money is both a multiplier and a dampener on the money supply, depending on how frequently dollars are changing hands. If dollars are changing hands a lot, it's a multiplier. If dollars are changing hands not so frequently, not so often, it's a dampener on the money supply. The next part of the equation is price, P, and that's the price of goods, aka inflation. And the next part is Q, or quantity, the quantity of goods. So you see the money supply increase in this part of the equation. It needs to be equal to the right part of the equation. Money supply increases, holding everything else constant. Prices or quantity should increase. We're going to talk about what's actually happening here in a second. If you find this confusing, don't worry. It's all going to become very clear here in a second. So the Federal Reserve's case for stimulus is that in 2008, velocity of money was already at historical lows. Typically, we're a bit higher than 2.2, but velocity of money was already at historical lows, and it dropped further down to about 1.7. So we could stimulate the economy without having big repercussions from inflation. And we did stimulate the economy. We increased the money supply, and we saw that inflation was lower, and we'll see that here in a second. But right now, too, velocity is at an all-time low, even lower than it was in 2008. So that emboldens the Fed even further. So what happened in 2008 was we expanded the money supply by about 13%, and as a result, we only saw around 2% annual inflation from 2008 to 2012, below the 3% target, and that's largely due to the low velocity of money. As I said earlier, money wasn't changing hands as frequently as it should be, dampening the effect of that monetary stimulus. So going back to the equation, if velocity is low, we should be able to stimulate the economy with minimal inflation. So money supply increases, velocity decreases, dampening that money supply increasing. Prices theoretically should stay relatively even or equal. But what happens if the quantity decreases? So money supply increases, velocity decreases, prices theoretically stay the same. But what happens if the quantity decreases? Right now, we're seeing a supply shock. I think a lot of people are conceptualizing the supply shock as we're not producing enough goods. The quantity is actually below where it should be, and theoretically that's correct. I'm going to explain the nuances of that statement or where we're really at here in a second. But yeah, if quantity is decreasing, then this pressure on the right side of the equation needs to go somewhere, and it goes to price. So price increases, and that's inflation. So what's actually happening? This is a really good chart from Bridgewater that came out a couple of weeks ago. It explains really well the situation that we're seeing at the moment. So the blue line is the demand for US consumer goods, and the red line is the supply for US consumer goods or production of US consumer goods. And so you can see that the blue line here, this is January in 2020 when the COVID virus just really started picking up globally. You could see that actually in relation to before the world went into an economic recession, demand is actually substantially higher than it was at that point. Demand has actually increased by about 20%, which is massive. And supply has actually also increased, but it hasn't increased as much. It's only increased by 5%. So we've got this gap here between supply and demand that is essentially resulting in this increase in prices. So what does this look like in the equation? Money supply increases from the Fed printing money. Velocity is decreasing, dampening the effect, but there's still so much money in the system that prices are increasing, even though quantity is increasing, just not at a quick enough rate. There's another thing that's actually important to point out here is part of this too is just people spending has shifted as a result of the virus. People are still afraid to go outside, still afraid to go out on vacation, so they're spending less money on services. They're spending more money on actual goods. And so as a result of that mismatch, there's just way more demand for actual goods than there is supply, and so you get that price appreciation. The other last thing to mention here is that there's a lot of blame going around on the supply chain and the supply chain just like falling apart. The supply chain is actually functioning okay, given the quantity of goods that we're trying to force through it. I read in The Economist or somewhere recently that the amount of throughput at the Port of Los Angeles has actually increased by 5% since like before the pandemic started. So we are increasing the amount of goods that we are shipping through the supply chain. We just excuse me. We just can't force this many goods through the supply chain with the infrastructure that we currently have. So why isn't the velocity of money picking up? And this is a good question, one that I don't have the answer to. I don't know. I can speculate a little bit. One of the things is that reason that I mentioned earlier, that we still have this big imbalance between goods and durable goods or consumer goods and services. The other thing is that velocity of money and GDP are lagging indicators. So we might see this actually uptick soon. It won't be a massive uptick, but we should see it start increasing again. The last thing is that the calculations depend on US GDP, which is being suppressed by net imports. Below, you could see a graph of our net exports of goods and services. You could see that it is negative. And since the recession started, our trade deficit, the US trade deficit, has actually increased substantially. And so the way I interpret this is as that we've injected a ton of money in the economy, and because people are spending more money on goods rather than services, a lot of that money has actually flown out of the United States over to China to buy consumer goods that are now being imported in. And there's not enough consumer goods to go around, so we're seeing that price appreciation. The reason why this would matter for the velocity of money calculation is I'm not going to get into the nuances of it, but GDP is a component of the velocity of money equation, and net exports of goods and services is a component of GDP. We'll talk about that more later if people are interested. But going forward, my predictions are for this next year is that the Federal Reserve is actually going to be correct. We should see this situation rectify itself. Um, we should see inflation be transitory, coming down to an average annualized rate of around 3.5% by this time next year. Going forward for this next month, I'm expecting that the S&P 500 will be at least 1% higher than its current point. I'm expecting that the NASDAQ will be relatively flat within plus or minus 1% of its current point, and I'm expecting that the Russell will also be relatively flat within plus or minus 1% of its current point. I hope you found this video useful. If you did, give it a thumbs up, subscribe, maybe I'll make more of these, and leave some comments. Always happy to hear what you guys have to say. Thank you so much.